Hello everyone, today my guest is Mike Dyson. Mike, I am very excited to have you today. You're one of the first people that came to mind to have as a interviewee for conversations on transition. Partly because, my work involving rites of passage, there was a lot of synergies, so I knew that there was a lot we could talk about. But also because I really think that, the time that we're going through and even the notion of transition itself is so linked to moving through different stages of life. So, the work that you do with Good Blokes Co, the transition from being a boy to being a man. But yeah, very much this time that we're in terms of the big picture transition is kind of like a collective rite of passage for humanity where maybe we're moving from being an embryo, kind of coming out through the birth canal into this whole different reality.
Yeah.
Or maybe we're kind of like an adolescent that hasn't quite learnt to step up into its responsibility. And I think that's a big challenge for us in how we navigate this transition is how do we collectively as humanity learn to kind of step into our role as a responsible member of the group.
Yeah.
On a global scale.
Totally.
So, Mike, I first met as a Chinese medicine practitioner, but knew of his other work initially, and from going to see him in the clinic, I realised how much we had to talk about, and was very impressed. Very recently, he left that medical world behind to launch fully into his work with Good Blokes Co. So.
Yeah.
I'll let you introduce what it is you do with Good Blokes Co and why you think it's important, and yeah.
Great. Thanks for having me.
No problem.
Always a pleasure to continue the conversation. So big transition for me going from, juggling two jobs. I've been in Chinese medicine for 15 years, pretty much. And have been growing this work on the side, a side hustle of working in rites of passage work with boys and with adolescent boys and with men, started doing work under the Good Blokes Co model a few years ago, and really realised over the last few years that it was time for me to move into that. I was just being called to move into that on a more full-time basis. So the whole coronavirus sort of shutdown thing was really a perfect opportunity for me to the phone stopped ringing. I didn't have any clients in the clinic. I was like, great.
Yeah.
I'll tidy that up.
Yeah.
And it was really hard to let go of that. It was really hard to leave, but to step more fully into work that I feel like is, it doesn't feel like work.
Yeah.
Which is why I know it's a good choice. So yeah, I do a bunch of work. I work in schools on rite of passage program with boys and with girls as well, with young people in general. Yeah, I do some work with a mental health charity called Zero to Hero, which is a rite of passage designed on the rite of passage framework, youth mental health leadership camp.
Oh wow.
So do a bunch of work with them, and in a few other spaces. And then my passion project is Good Blokes Co, which really spawned out of the work I was doing through the Rites of Passage Institute, which came from the Pathways Foundation, if people are familiar with the Pathways to Manhood, Pathways to Womanhood camps that were running in Australia for many, many years. And I just noticed that a father and son pair would come on this camp. We do them in northern New South Wales. Couples of fathers and sons come from all over the country. They have this incredible experience of bonding, and then they dissipate back home to their four corners of the country and internationally as well, and they never see each other again. So I was really noticing the lack of community in that model. So I had the idea to start running these father-son camps for pre-existing groups of mates, and then I got this random phone call from Jim and said, I want to run this camp for me and my mate John want to run a camp for our boys. And I said, oh, that's what I'm doing. So we ran the first camp in 2016, and it was incredible. And that just really inspired me to do more of this work in pre-existing communities, helping boys to become men and helping men to connect with each other.
That's such a great point. That's something I've noticed from running quests is the challenge is that, well, go back a step, in the framework of a rite of passage, the stepping back from the ordeal or in any initiation, the when you return from the ordeal,
Yeah.
you're greeted back by your community who recognises you as change. So
Welcomed and celebrated.
Yeah, and so there's this like reinforcing, it's why it's so effective of and why in many cultures adolescence didn't even exist, because you can so effectively really have such a big step change in your life when it's held within appropriate social structures. But definitely now, like, especially with the quest work with such a deep kind of spiritual aspect to it, I've noticed that it can be very challenging for people to be able to come back into their normal life and without having that recognition. So I was even, thinking in my mind of moving to like doing it with how great it would be to do it with small groups of people who already know each other, so that they can really enforce it. So
can have a support network, someone who's seen what you've gone through, has really witnessed you coming out of that ordeal and saying, this is me now, this is where I'm going. And it's hard to have that experience by yourself and then come back to your family and say, oh, can we have a chat about these massive changes that have happened? And it's like, I've just got to do the laundry first. And So that's the challenge. For me, the rite of passage framework is an incredibly powerful tool. The tricky part is getting people there in the first place. And then supporting them afterwards. Because we don't live in a world that really is consciously aware of that framework and how important it is.
Do you want to explain a bit more about the framework, like what a rite of passage in that model is?
Yeah, so I learnt the framework through Arne Rubinstein, who runs the Rite of Passage Institute, who I do some work for now. And he talks about, those three phases which were identified by Arnold van Gennep 100 years or so ago. And there's, been a bit of an expansion of that model, and it links into that Joseph Campbell's work, the hero's journey. There's the separation phase. There's the stepping away from our normal state of being, but separating into what? Into a sacred space, into a safely held container that it is held by a community. I mean, you could do it by yourself, but really, traditionally, rites of passage aren't a thing we want to do by ourselves. So is
the separation like something that starts happening before the individual realises that it's time to do something like that, or is it like the separation is within the actual conscious process?
Yeah, well, it could. I think it's a bit of both. I think we talk about an agitation. You know that it's time for a rite of passage when shit is starting to hit the fan. You know, when things are starting to shake up. Traditionally with the transition of boys to men, the elders would know that this boy is ready to become a man. Yeah. It's not the job of the father or the mother. Yeah. Traditionally in a lot of societies, the mother didn't want the boy because once the boy's gone, he's kind of gone from her. And the elders will say, it's time for this one. And we know that adolescent kind of agitation that I think all of us have felt at some point in our lives, like it's time for something to shift. Like I just left town. I just drove up to Broome. Yeah. I had to separate myself from the space where I was.
Yeah, which is a point I like to get back to later about the urge without appropriate containers, perhaps leading to unhealthy or unhelpful seeking of initiation.
Totally. Yeah, there's a lot of unhealthy stuff going to happen if we're not, creating these kind of spaces for people. So there's the agitation, and then that wanting to let go of our normal way of being, but separation into a container held by a community with elders and mentors and people there, and creating of a sacred space. So, logistically on our camps, that's going into the bush, that's leaving your mobile phone at home. I make blokes that come on my men's retreat sign a thing that says, I'm not going to bring any work or my laptop or my mobile phone or any booze, so no alcohol, none of these things that distract us from the real stuff. Yeah. So creating that separation phase, and then going into, like you mentioned, the ordeal, the challenge, so into that liminal space that I'm not a boy anymore, but I'm not quite a man yet, or whatever that transition is, whether that's a man becoming a father, becoming an elder, becoming a leader, becoming a retired person, like whatever the stage of life is. It's a process. The rite of passage framework is a framework we can use to meaningfully recognise and celebrate that transition. Okay. So you hit on a point there around, does the separation happen first or does it happen during? And the other thing I wanted to bring up is like, well, are we creating a change through a rite of passage, or are we recognizing a change that's already happening?
Yeah.
And I don't have an answer. I think it's actually kind of both of those things.
Totally.
So we talk about letting go of stuff that's not serving us anymore. We talk about creating a new vision of who we want to be. There's a big sharing of stories. There's a challenge or an ordeal, and that sort of in that transition space, that liminal space, and then there's a return. The return where our transition is acknowledged, witnessed, and celebrated by the community around us, and that's one of the big problems I think that we have in this work is creating a space where people come back from that experience and they're witnessed and recognised. A lot of us have that experience of going travelling after we finish school as a young person, and we come back after 18 months of travelling around the country or around the world, and we're like, oh my God, I'm so different as a person. And our mates are like, yeah, that's fine. Let's just go to the footy and have a beer, sort of thing.
We always used to. Yeah.
So we're not witnessed, we're not recognised. So what do? We get addicted to travel, or,
Yeah.
in my case, I just stop hanging out with those people.
Yeah.
Which is a shame. I think it's sad.
Yeah, definitely. I think, once I started doing the quest work, spending a lot of time in solitude in the wilderness, it was almost like a dark night of the soul, not that caused me to go and do these things. Well, I guess in a way it kind of was. But getting hit by a truck, not so much in terms of a crisis of meaning, but definitely afterwards when you kind of, I don't actually fit where I used to fit.
Yeah.
And, I can't really relate to a lot of the people that I used to hang out with. So, what do? You sort of, have to just sit with it and be very clear on who you are, which fortunately you are a little clearer on who you are.
Yeah.
And wait for sort of the other elements of the new to start coming in and forming a life around you.
Yeah. It's a big issue that's not in that initial sort of framework that we use. What we talk about is using community to support the integration of that experience. And it's like, well, how do you do that in a community that's not aware of what that experience was?
Exactly.
Because traditionally in a rite of passage, in any kind of initiation, everyone knows what goes on. Well, not everyone knows. People know what the transition is about, and then they know what your role is after that. This is what's expected of you, and there's a recognition of, this is what this person's role is. This is what this person's strength is. This is what this person has to offer.
Yeah.
So it's about creating ways as much as you can to we talk about doing this with boys. It's when the boy comes home from the camps, like we talk to the dads a lot. How are you going to create this space with his uncles and aunties, with his mum, with his grandparents, to for you as the father to say, this is what has happened for my son.
Yeah.
To give that boy a stronger sense of recognition. But it's tough because he's still going to go to school with people that don't recognise him as a young man now, and his mates and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah, definitely. And it's like, there's so much we can do in sort of the framing of a project when, real process, when really what we're trying to address in whatever way we can, the gap that exists in culture. It's one thing I want to explore with this Conversations on Transition project. The tagline is resilience and regeneration in WA, and I very much also mean cultural regeneration, because the absence of the cultural structures which really result in health, both on a personal level and on a societal and ecological level, just really aren't there. And certainly I think that everything we just talked about in terms of what's not there to hold, recognise, instigate any initiation or rite of passage work is a big gap. Yeah.
And we're built for this. I mean, rites of passage have existed throughout human history, according to historians and anthropologists. We've always created sacred space, and we've always had ceremonies to mark these transition points in life. And we find ourselves in a world where I feel like we've stepped away from traditional religions for many would say for a good reason. But what have we replaced it with? We've replaced it with science and consumerism.
Yeah, individualism versus the...
individualism, and we don't have spaces to, really connect more deeply to what is this transition point in my life, and what support do I need moving forward, and how do I stay connected to this new person that I'm becoming. So, I think it's in us. I think when we start talking about this rites of passage framework, people can identify, this was a rite of passage for me, and this was an initiation for me.
Totally.
They know, and then you say, so was the community involved? And they'll say, no. And were you conscious of it? And they'll say, no. And was there a mentor or an elder guiding you through that process? And they'll say, no. And it's like, well, those are the obvious bits that are there's lots of bits that are missing, but there's bits that are there that we generally want to create because they don't exist in really conscious ways.
Yeah.
Which leads to the more unhealthy versions that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the classic of whether it's uni students or, other young adults, doing extreme, behaviours like excessive drinking and partying and just general risk-taking.
Wanting to challenge themselves, that ordeal that you talked about, wanting to feel the edge of what am I capable of, and and the use of drugs without any kind of a guidance, without any kind of spiritual guidance to, maybe that's young people or old people of all ages trying to explore the mysteries of life.
Definitely.
Whereas when you sit there with a an elder, a guide who can say, traditionally substances are being used throughout the world to guide people. I don't use that sort of stuff in my programs, but
good to clarify.
Yeah. But when there's an elder there guiding you through it, then there's more chance that you'll get yourself to somewhere sort of meaningful through that sort of process. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, certainly the amount of times I get asked about on the quest, so is there, plant medicine involved?
Yeah.
That's one way, something called technology. Not sure I really like calling it a technology. But it just shows what an inherent, fundamentally needed part of life, that being able to just step outside of your old self for a period of time so that you can be reformed, and whether it's through using various forms of psychedelics or through doing something like a quest or a different rite of passage, it's certainly orientated around the same need.
That need for a sense of separation and a sacred space, you could say. And it's interesting, we talk about sacred space and some people get a bit scared off by the term of that. But I'm really into making that relevant. My business is called Good Blokes Co. So there's not a lot of chanting and dancing and candles and all this kind of stuff. It's like, well, how can we as men create a space that feels really freaking important?
Yeah.
That's sacred. What does sacred means? Reverent. How can we really I talk about respecting the shit out of each other, which is kind of a way to translate it into the language of the average normal bloke. It's and I've had this conversation with boys, had an amazing conversation with boys at a school I was working with recently, and I said, if we were going to have a really important conversation about the stuff we don't normally talk about, what would we need to have that conversation? And they were like, we need to trust each other, and we need mutual input. We need everyone to be able to put something in, and we need it to be some kind they almost rehashed the rules that we normally use at the start of a camp.
Yeah.
And then I was like, so what would we talk about if we had those conditions? And they said, and all of a sudden they just started having this amazing conversation that would never happen at the school, just by me asking those two questions. What would we need and what would we talk about?
Wow.
And they just did it themselves.
Yeah.
It's an extraordinary experience.
I'm glad you brought up that story. I remember you telling me about, the other sort of experiences that you've had doing that work in schools where really the actual wisdom of the boys are already there, but not being in a space or in a society where that's allowed to come out. It stays within this is how you're meant to behave.
Yeah.
Do you want to share some more examples of
especially in the school, from that top down, this is the expected behaviour and this is not. And we go into schools and we facilitate, effectively personal, social, emotional learning. And you can't tell people self-awareness. You can't teach people awareness of their own selves. You have to draw it out. So it's a really different approach. So we set out this space, we're like, what do you guys think about this? And they come up with it. We ask questions around what kind of man do you want to be? What are the character traits of the kind of man that you want to become? And they come up with everything that any human of any age would want to be. It's I want to be strong, dependable, reliable, humble, caring, loving, funny, like all of the things that every human wants to be. And then we talk about, okay, what pressures do we feel to be as a man? What's the pressure we feel to be a certain way as a man? And then they talk about, you know, dominant, tough, in control, alpha, boss, all of this kind of stuff. I'm like, all right, what's the problem with these two things? We've got two sides of the whiteboard up here. And they'll say, oh, how am I going to be that if we're pressuring each other to be that? And then I say, well, right, well, how do you want to support each other? If you guys all want to be strong, reliable, dependable, respectful, caring, hilarious, mateship, teamwork, all of the good stuff, how do we move from that to that? And they just start coming up with their own ideas. So I don't think you really need to teach boys a lot about becoming a young man, but you really need to create a solid space where they can have this kind of conversation. And then they don't have spaces where they can have this conversation, and it's actually not crazy difficult. You just got to put aside your idea that I know best and I'm going to tell them what a good man is. You have to be willing to listen, and I think a lot of people don't trust young people these days. But when I go into space and I really listen to young people, particularly young boys, like, they naturally want to be caring, loving, respectful, reliable, dependable young people. But I think we're letting them down. I don't think we're giving them the spaces to really define what that means and then support them to be that. So,
Thank you. And what do you think might be, like, what if so many more young boys, young men, had the opportunity to either have these conversations and to go through rites of passage? What would be the difference in the world?
Yeah, well, if we're talking about boys, like, what if we could create a culture where every boy got a chance to say, oh, well, I can put aside what society wants me to be as a man and just be myself. I don't think, I think there's this fear that we're all going to turn, boys won't be boys anymore. They'll all just want to wear pink tutus and dance with the fairies. I'm like, they might, but I don't think the majority of boys want to do that. If we make it okay for the boys that want to wear pink tutus to wear pink tutus, and the boys that want to be heavy lifting farmers to be farmers, then people can just be who they are. And I think when we have permission to just be ourselves, then the world becomes a much more caring and kind place.
Totally.
I think when we're not trying to force ourselves to be a certain way, and we're ready to respect other people to be who they want to be, rather than saying, oh, you don't fit the norms of our society, and just smack them down. I think it becomes a much kinder place. I think boys can be more kind to themselves. Like, the rates of anxiety and depression and male suicide in Australia are horrific. 3/4 of suicides in Australia are men. And the stats show that the more you adhere to that stereotypical view of masculinity, the more likely you are to be depressed, the more likely you are to have thoughts of suicide, and the less likely you are to ask for help. So, number one, it is better for men's wellness. And number two, like, what about the impact it has on the other people around us, the impact on women and children and domestic violence and these kinds of things. I
also think, so often, like, you look at the sorts of leaders that we have as well, and you wonder how much really it's a sort of adolescent struggle for power that continues into adulthood, and this society is sort of rewarding those who have power-seeking behaviours, because it takes a lot to get to the top. You've got to be really committed to wanting that power.
Definitely. I think there's a lot of, and you look at world leaders, you look at a snippet of, it's been a while since I've seen a snippet of parliamentary question time, but that is
good, is much better.
It's pretty similar to, like, a fight in a primary school. It's really childish behaviour that you see there.
Exactly.
And I could point to the President of the United States as someone who seems to have no capacity to take responsibility for his own actions. Like, within the same interview, you see him saying one thing and then denying that he said it. It's like, that wasn't me. It's Bart Simpson. They voted Bart Simpson in as the president of their country. It seems like a really odd choice. But what kind of society wants that as their leader?
Exactly.
It's like that's an adolescent society.
Yeah, definitely.
That is not valuing men who stand up and say, "Oh, I've made a big mistake there. I'm going to do everything I can to put it right." How often do you see a man on the news saying, "Yep, I've made a big mistake there. I'm going to work everything as I can to really help that person out that I've hurt and to make this situation right." Like, it's a simple apology, but we just don't see men taking responsibility for their actions. You know?
Yeah, and I think at that point about, the type of society that has put those, kinds of people in those kinds of positions, that's also an important question. Like when leaders are not willing to admit that they were wrong or that they don't know the answer yet, perceived as a sign of weakness. And that's actually a very real, political thing. Like, would we be ready for someone who behaved in that way?
Yeah, for someone who said, "Oh, I'm not sure and I don't have all the answers,
Exactly.
but I'm going to work my hardest to work out what the right solution is here."
Yeah.
It's like it's that seen as some kind of a weakness. Someone who's, even the idea of he's a flip-flopper because he changed his mind. It's like, well, what if he just got better information?
Exactly.
I find it really bizarre. And then you look at the corporate world and it's like, how have we structured corporations so that only someone who is willing to sacrifice all kind of personal relationships and work 75 hours a week
Exactly.
is the person who can be the CEO.
Yeah.
It's like, how can we restructure corporations so that we can welcome the type of people who value family, who value, weekends, who value having a day off?
Yeah, totally. And I think that's where it gets, why I'm trying to use this opportunity of, normal really sort of disappearing under our feet. Because, it's then very difficult for organisations or corporations to change because they still exist within the, fairly cutthroat, you make it or you don't kind of financial environment. So really, just the very core of where our systems are built from and the culture and worldviews that inform that's the level of change that we really need to get to, because otherwise no one can escape the trap. Even if you had good intentions and I want to be this kind of leader, well, some people manage to carve out a very particular niche for themselves and their work, but it's such a combination of, the culture and the society reinforcing the individual, but then the individual's then also not being empowered to be able to make the changes as well. So I think a lot, this work with Rites of Passage, we're working with individuals or perhaps small, groups or family units, but trying to tell the stories of that so that we can then kind of have this spill out effect into the wider culture as well.
Yeah.
And I have no idea, that's sort of the theory, but it's so important that this infiltrates into culture and social structures that, I'm not sure that there's really any answer to sort of scaling it up. It almost has to be wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a small community where it was, how can we do some sort of prototype in a way of what if we tried on this way of governance for ourselves, that incorporated, people discovering or getting a deeper sense of their purpose through some kind of rite of passage, and they're actually having a material impact in what they did in the community.
Yeah. Connecting.
That'd be the dream.
Yeah. Connecting to purpose on a deeper level. And so it's interesting the time that we're in now. I think it's given us an opportunity to shake some things up. I've seen, and one of the things I talk about with men is that men are much more likely to be refused requests for flexible work. So a man that wants to shake things up a little bit and just work 4 days a week so he can look after his kids, so that his partner, who might be a woman, can work.
Yeah.
Men are very often shut down from that. Men hear things like, "Oh, that's for women." Flexible work.
Yeah.
So this is really interesting in this coronavirus sort of shutdown phase. Everyone's now working from home, and I've had a couple of mates that say to their boss, "See, I can work from home." One of my mates has bought a property down south. He's like, "I don't need to be in the city anymore. I'm moving to the country," which is pretty amazing.
Awesome.
And he's created that for himself by really pushing for it. But what if leaders of organisations actively were seeking flexibility?
Yeah.
As a as a positive trait in the workplace.
Yeah.
I think this stage we're going through now is definitely, it has all the hallmarks of a rite of passage. It's certainly been an ordeal. It's been challenging. We're out of our normal routine. We're separated from our normal way of being.
Yeah.
The key is to be really conscious what throughout this phase has worked for me and what has not worked for me, and what bits do I want to step straight back into, because it's really easy to just go, okay, kids are back at school, I'm back to work 50 hours a week, and then bang.
Yeah.
Whereas if we really take the time to go, well, hang on, what's worked for me and what am I ready to actually fight for?
Yeah.
Because if we want change, we've got to have the courage to stand up and say, this is not working for me.
Yeah.
Which is tough. Firstly, to get clear on what is important and which part of this have I really enjoyed, and which parts of it have been pretty rubbish.
Totally. Yeah.
And then have the courage to stand up and say, this is important to me.
And I hope we do that, both individually in whatever teams or groups that we work in, and that, I guess even this project is an attempt of some form of collective conversation on what have we learned, what's good for us, what have we discovered about our priorities, and who do we really want to be.
And for leaders to have the courage to say, oh, there's actually real benefits in this. Some people are working from home. Some people are sharing roles now. There's there's a courage to say, oh, actually the old way wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
And as a leader, when you're in charge of the old way, and that goes back to that whole thing around having the courage to say, I found new information. I've changed my mind.
Exactly.
To risk being called a flip-flopper.
Yeah.
And to say, this has been a great opportunity. Let's do things a little bit different now.
Yeah, on that point of working from home, I used to work for the Department of Transport, and I remember spending quite a lot of time looking at the potential impacts of a 4-day work week or different work hours, and we were trying to promote telework, and so there wasn't so many cars on the road.
Yeah.
Always just seemed like too hard basket, both for people individually, for the organisations, and certainly when things involved society-wide, policy changes around, what were work hours and that kind of thing. It would just seem like something that it's not really anything we could do about it.
Yeah.
And then a big change or a big, forced change happens, and suddenly it's possible.
Yeah.
So, and obviously that's just one example, but I'm sure there's a lot of things that we thought weren't ever feasible, and now suddenly we go, oh, actually we can make big changes.
Yeah.
And
because we had to.
And but even that was kind of a choice. Different countries took different approaches to what was implemented, and then it becomes really about priority. And what do we really value?
For sure. Yeah, interesting times.
Yeah. So I guess we can probably round out the conversation, but is there anything else you wanted to talk about, I guess, in terms of rites of passage or healthy masculinity, or
I guess my passion around healthy masculinity is creating spaces where we can have real conversations with men. If you're a bloke or if you're not a bloke, there's blokes in your life who need real conversations, particularly young guys, particularly young men. Let's make the effort to create spaces where those conversations can happen.
Yeah.
And maybe that's taking your boy for a walk or for a long drive or whatever, creating the sacred space, whether that's in the car or down at a cafe or whatever. Create the space to make those conversations happen, because I think young guys desperately just want to be themselves, and they do feel a great deal of pressure to be a certain way as men, which is not making them happy, and it's not making the people around them happy when things get difficult as they age. And the thing for me around rites of passage is that they are a cross-cultural phenomenon that have happened throughout history. There is a need that we have to create a sacred space to deeply consider who we are. And I think this whole strange, wacky coronavirus shutdown period is a golden opportunity. So take the opportunity and create some space to really connect to purpose and make a conscious choice around how we want to move forward coming out of this, and have the courage to lead.
Yeah.
Because we don't create change unless some of us are willing to step up and say, I'm going to make this different.
Yeah. Beautiful. very nice summary.
Thanks to chat. It's been good
Thanks
fun.
for coming.
Wonderful.